Bob's extraordinary life began in the year 1820. His beginnings were, however, far from extraordinary, quite ordinary in fact. Like 2 million other Africans in America, Bob was enslaved, the legal property of another. Bob grew up with his mother and siblings in Washington, D.C.'s prestigious National Hotel. As the so-called property of affluent hotel tycoon John Gadsby, Bob worked unnoticed by the comings and goings of the hotel's distinguished guests living in the hotel's slave quarters. The National Hotel bustled daily with wealthy dignitaries, politicians, Henry Clay of Kentucky, Texas statesman Stephen Austin, and President Andrew Jackson. Even actor John Wilkes Booth took up residence in the hotel as he put the finishing touches on his final act. One of the hotel's regular guests was Massachusetts Senator, two-time Secretary of State, and former presidential candidate Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster's visits to the hotel didn't seem to be one way. Years later, a Senate House doorman recalled that a young enslaved boy named Bob made frequent visits to the Senate House to see Senator Webster. The purpose of these visits is unknown. What is known is that John Gadsby gifted Bob to his son, who then, in turn, promptly lost Bob in a poker game. And just like that, at the age of 20, Bob found himself far from the nation's capital, enslaved on South Carolina's Rosemont plantation. Bob's wide-ranging skills began to flourish, from food preparation, pastries, preserving and pickling, to sharpening his skills as a barber. A wealthy planter named Benjamin Yancey Jr. often visited Rosemont Plantation, and it wasn't long before Bob convinced Yancey to purchase both he and his wife. Bob's pitch must have been remarkable. Yancey had multiple homes, 3 large plantations, all staffed with a number of enslaved workers. There was no obvious need to purchase Bob. Yancey did make one demand upon purchase, that Bob give up card playing and gambling altogether. Bob apparently agreed, but his biggest gamble was already in the works. Bob was betting on himself. Over the years, Yancey described Bob as truthful, sober, affectionate, honest. He went on to say that Bob was a faithful servant, much attached to me, my wife, and children. At the time, Yancey couldn't have known how important Bob would be in his life. In 1858, President James Buchanan appointed Benjamin Yancey to Ambassador of Argentina. Upon leaving to fill his diplomatic post, Yancey made a deal with Bob. He would set Bob up with a barbershop in Atlanta, and in return, Bob would pay Yancey a monthly cut of his earnings. I gave him practical freedom and the means of making and using money, Yancey would say. In no time, Bob had 2 barbershops with 7 barbers on his payroll and was running a loan sharking business from his barbershop back room. The lion's share of Bob's income came from loaning money to out-of-luck and desperate gamblers of all persuasions. By the time Yancey returned to the States 2 years later, he found Bob and family situated in a hilltop residence overlooking downtown Atlanta. The home was deeded to Benjamin Yancey. Those considered property themselves were not permitted to own property. For a time, Yancey was living in Virginia. But when the outbreak of war seemed inevitable, Yancey told Bob to take his wife and 3 children to their house in Alabama. I would have trusted him with anything, Yancey said of Bob. During that short time, Yancey said Bob would boss the plantation in his absence. When the nation finally exploded into civil war, Yancey was living in Atlanta. The war transformed the dusty railroad depot into an industrialized city. Atlanta cranked out much-needed war supplies for the newly formed Confederate States of America. The streets hummed with activity. Anxious soldiers flowed out to the front lines, while wounded soldiers poured in, destined for war hospitals. Businesses capitalized on the wartime excitement. Bob, no doubt, played his part in Atlanta's vibrant commercial scene. As the Civil War intensified, refugees flooded Atlanta from surrounding Union-occupied cities. Chaos reigned. But Bob's cool strategic business sense only heightened. He began investing in gold and United States currency, just in case the Confederacy and their freshly printed dollars didn't last. As an enslaved man, Bob mixed freely with Union prisoners of war as they awaited transport to Confederate prison camps. Knowing the captives would need Confederate dollars in order to navigate the Confederate prison system, Bob traded them Confederate currency for United States currency in return. In some cases, Bob traded as much as 300 Confederate dollars for one United States dollar. The U.S. dollars that landed in Bob's hands were further invested in a menagerie of desired goods, produce, and the scarce wartime commodity that was perhaps in the highest demand, tobacco. Bob later boasted, "I never made less than $100 a day." A fellow Atlanta businessman said that Bob had money, gold watches, always about him, and went on to say that Bob was one of the biggest traders we had here in Atlanta. As an enslaved man with no legal rights, a man regarded as the property of another in the midst of a land fighting to keep it that way, Bob made certain to outwardly show allegiance to his so-called master Ben Yancey and his Confederate cause. This was a matter of survival and a matter of financial gain. Bob's inward feelings seemed to paint a different picture. Those who remained loyal to the United States stuck to the underground networks and back channels of the Confederate South. At great risk, Unionists worked in secrecy with the purpose of undermining the Confederate agenda. After the war, it became more clear that Bob was deeply involved in Unionist activities. One Atlanta Unionist testified that Bob was one of the 35 or 36 loyal men of the city during the war. Another Unionist said of Bob, he was the heart and soul of a Union man. If any inclination of Union sympathies had eked out of Bob's persona, the world he'd worked so hard to create and maintain would have come crashing down. The thought of being caught and what the punishment might be could not have been far from his thoughts. Yet, when a Unionist was imprisoned, he was able to escape. The rope used in his escape was supplied by none other than Bob. When two Union soldiers needed refuge, it was Bob who hid them in his own attic, keeping them out of sight until their eventual rescue. Bob reached hero status after the 1864 Battle of Atlanta. Hundreds of wounded Union soldiers were left to die in an open field under the searing Georgia sun. Not one would dare offer help, fearing repercussions of the still roving Confederate military. Not one, that is, until Bob chose to act. He brought water to the would-be doomed U.S. soldiers. Bob then organized teams of enslaved people to help transport the wounded to a war hospital. Bob paid for food and hired people to help in further rescue efforts. Eventually, the besieged Atlanta did fall to Union forces. Sherman's famous March to the Sea made sure Atlanta, along with the entire Confederate South, felt the full weight and might of the United States, making certain all understood how the U.S. deals with traitors. Before burning Atlanta, Union soldiers looted the city, taking anything deemed helpful to the Union effort, while ransacking and destroying everything else. Bob's warehouse of goods, produce, livestock, and valuable tobacco was laid to waste. In the aftermath of war, a freshly emancipated Bob attempted to recoup his $10,000 loss through the federal courts. Despite testimony of many highlighting his wealth and loyalty to the United States, his claims fell on deaf ears. The court ruling nearly broke Bob. Nearly, but not quite. The post-war South may have laid in shambles, but Bob did not. He had a stash, enough to get him going again. But nothing would be the same. The war broke many a wealthy Southerner, including Bob's now former so-called master, Benjamin Yancey. A penniless Yancey was left with 4 horses and a few acres of scorched earth. All seemed lost, but he had one more card to play. Yancey wrote Bob asking if he could loan me $150. Bob's response? He sent his former so-called owner $100 in gold, another $100 in silver, and the promise of more if needed. With the loan, Yancey restored his credit and his name. He hired freedmen to rebuild, breathing life back into his agricultural operations and rejuvenating his bank account. During the period of Reconstruction, Bob enjoyed continued financial success. He resumed his barbershop business and became a well-known player in the progressive politics of Reconstruction. It was said that Bob was known to every politician in Georgia. When Atlanta became the Georgia state capital, Bob paid for the housing of black politicians new to the city. But the progress of Reconstruction was short-lived. The educational, political, and societal gains made by black people was cut off by the end of federal programs in place to help and protect the newly freed population of 4 million. With the death of Reconstruction came the birth of Jim Crow. Black people were left to fend for themselves in a land where too many resented their freedom and were vehemently embarked on efforts to return blacks to their previous state under the foot of society. This was a bleak period for the newly freed population, and Bob was no exception to the suffering. Bob penned, or dictated, a letter to his former so-called master, Benjamin Yancey. In it, he said, "My old master and friend, please give me a start in this world once more." Although there is no recorded response from Yancey, a newspaper reported that Yancey financially supported Bob, his wife, and daughter. In the year 1883, Bob died. He was 63 years old. Throughout his life, this shrewd businessman with gold in his pockets and a heart full of gold had been referred to as Bob Gadsby, Bob Cunningham, and when an 1879 newspaper referred to him as Bob Yancey, Bob responded. He insisted that his true name was Robert Webster, his rightful surname due to the fact that the man that young Bob frequently visited at the U.S. Senate in Washington, D.C., the Massachusetts Senator, 2-time Secretary of State, and presidential candidate, the famed politician Daniel Webster, was his father. The full story of Robert Webster's extraordinary life may never be known, but what is known should never be forgotten.